All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Spark My Muse podcast. Today, I have two guests. It's kind of an unusual thing. Lee and Simon from A Matter of Faith podcast, a Presby podcast. And before we jump too much into whatever we decide we're going to talk about today, really was interested in getting kind of from each of you sort of a bio, if you could sort of self introduce and talk about how you got connected to do this podcast, and also what else do you wind up doing, like what are your passion projects or other work that you're involved in. I don't know who wants to kick it off first.
Go ahead,
Lee.
Simon.
Sure. Well, hi everyone. My name is Simon Dune, and as Lisa said, Lee and I both work for the Presbyterian Church USA in some of the denominational offices, and we are co-hosts of A Matter of Faith, a Presby podcast. But that's actually a fairly small portion of both of our jobs. I work in what's called the Office of Faith-Based Investing and Shareholder Engagement for the denomination, which is a long way to say that our denomination has billions of dollars invested in the stock market for things like pastors' pension plans. And so we engage the companies that the denomination is invested in to try to improve those companies' practices and policies and bring them more into alignment with the church's values. And so we've done a lot of engagements with airlines historically on human trafficking issues, a lot of more recent engagements with oil and gas companies on climate change issues, and historically a lot of engagements related to tech companies and their products being used for weapons or connected to human rights violations in places like in Africa and in the Middle East. And so it's hard work, it's good work, it's meaningful work. But I also like having the podcast because it's a completely different aspect and sort of a different format to try to engage people in and engage in productive conversation. And before I was in this position, I was working for the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program in our denomination, focused on gun violence prevention efforts and sort of like non-violent conflict resolution. So that's a bit about me, and I'm super glad to be here and thankful to Lisa for having us.
Thanks, Simon.
Yeah, Lisa, thank you so much for having us. And I'm Lee Cato. I am the one of the co-hosts of A Matter of Faith, the Presby podcast. And as Simon was saying, it is a small part of our job, but I am also the editor of Unbound, justiceunbound.org. But it's called Unbound, and it is a publication under the Presbyterian Church USA that speaks to faith and justice. And we publish articles and devotionals, and we do a lot of series and all that kind of stuff that speaks to justice and just kind of offers a space for voices that don't normally get the platform to speak into theology and how we experience scripture and all those types of things. And so this is a fun part of my job, but I also have a pretty cool job. And just this past Advent, we have published a trans Advent, all trans people of faith, and it's a wonderful devotional. And so I hope people check that out too. But I am very lucky to get to do what I do and to be creative and all those wonderful things that I'm lucky to do. But thank you for having us. We love these kind of podcast collaborations, and the podcast has been such a gift in our lives, and we always are here to support fellow podcasters. So thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for that support. It was really fun to speak about my book on your podcast, and it makes me wonder, when you're doing your podcast, do you have particular audience or demographic in mind when you're doing that?
I think so. I think when we first started, and Simon can probably talk a little bit about this too, but when we first started, we really did want to provide a space for maybe people who aren't so churchy to come to something and to experience a conversation where it is a Presbyterian podcast, but we're not so Presbyterian that it's exclusive. We have so many people on. A lot of it's a very ecumenical podcast, and we wanted to have something to where people can experience an in-depth and genuine conversation that might be their church for the week. So I do think it reaches folk that that kind of walk the line of maybe a
Mhm.
traditional or denominational affiliation, but also just want to hear a different perspective. And
Mhm.
I think we do attract a lot of younger folk who
Uh-huh.
are interested in topics of justice and through that lens.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think that's initially what we were thinking, right, Simon?
Yeah, the thought was that people might be looking for ways to engage with questions and topics of faith and justice outside of a church sermon on a Sunday morning. And so we wanted to
Mhm.
provide a space where people could ask questions, because we know that everyone has questions related to faith, but we
Mhm.
may not feel comfortable voicing them because we think we're the only ones that have that kind of a question. And so by
Mhm.
providing a platform to ask those questions, we're hoping that people will listen and be like, oh, yeah, actually, I had that question too. And here's some folks that are sitting down with someone to talk about this in depth. And so it's open to
Mhm.
anyone. We like to say that if you're a person of faith or even faith adjacent, A Matter of Faith,
Mhm.
the Presby podcast could be a podcast for you, both as a listener or to submit questions.
Yeah, I like that about being kind of a third space, if you will, like with especially people under 30, 35 years old. There's this huge swath of people now that consider themselves none and not affiliated religiously, but still deeply spiritual sometimes or interested in the bigger questions. So the thirst and the hunger is out there, but a lot of people have lost faith in institutional organizations. Like Presby USA is an old one. It's like a mainline type of denomination, but there is a way that you can bridge into these spots where people are not necessarily going to darken the doors of a church, but they're still really interested in their hunger is there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the Presbyterian Church, and we're not apologists for the denomination, but I do think that, and we're not the only mainline denomination though. There are so many out
Mhm.
there that have such great kind of polity, and by what I mean for or
Mm.
policies, and by what I mean for that is saying that the church, not just the Peace USA, but a lot of different churches, if people out there don't realize, is that there are a lot of policies that we have that, we are pro immigrant, and we are pro LGBTQIA plus, and there are
Mhm.
so many policies in the church that aid in us being kind of a relevant presence. It's
Right.
just that sometimes these traditions and the institutions hold back even their own policies. And
Right.
so we're kind of here to also say that, there is like a space for people, and we don't necessarily have to kind of always identify or kind of jump into something that, might be more traditional, but that these traditions also lend themselves to a lot of more relevant things that are happening in our country, especially right now. And so I do think we're trying to be in some way that bridge builder, but also not kind of holding ourselves into a certain box to say, it's for us. I think the ecumenical part I've grown from it, and I know that the denomination has grown from it. And I think the more and more we partner and we do have more voices speaking into things, I do think that kind of unleashes us out of that box. So,
Mm.
yeah, it's kind of a bridge building type thing
Mm.
too, that we offer and say that we have policies on certain things. And some people are surprised about that. We ordain women and queer
Mhm.
people, and that's just something that's not well known. And so I think
Mm.
that's also a part of it, is getting the word out there more and more that yes, the church has done lot of damage, but it is working to undo some of that damage and do that
Mm.
repentance work. But it also offers a lot of kind of relevant things that people are looking for in maybe a faith space. So yeah,
Mm.
we might be bridge builders, which we try, but
Yeah. Want to chime in there, Simon, and add to that if you'd like.
Sure. I was just going to add that I think when people hear that, any sort of media that comes out of a mainline denomination, they might wonder, is it just sort of perpetuating, for lack of a better word, perpetuating the same, is it just a mouthpiece for the policies of the denomination as it
Mm.
currently stands? And the way that, would Lee and I, as denominational staff members, be able to challenge the denomination on its own, on its own stances, on its own values. And the way that we interpret that and understand that on the podcast is that Lee and I are co-hosts. And so we can pose questions to people and we'll tell people what the denomination's current stance is on an issue of faith and justice. But it's totally fine if a guest challenges that. It's fine if a guest says, actually, the denomination's doing great work, but we have to do more. And this is what that looks like. And so I think that the podcast then also allows us to challenge the denomination and interrogate its current stance. And Lee and I aren't afraid to sometimes say when our personal views may be different than the current stance or the current actions of the church as well. But it's not like the podcast exists to just spread, the denominational sort of lines and stances. It exists as a place to both challenge and inform and interrogate what the church is doing or not doing.
Well, that's the opposite of a cult. So, yeah, and that kind of circles me to what got me to want to have both of you fellas on my podcast, because we were talking a little bit about this when I was a guest on your podcast, that what is a Christian and what is allowed. And there's been this kind of empire takeover in some aspects of Christianity in, modern American incarnations, if you will, of Christianity, that there's these ideas also outside of Christianity, like, oh, this is what Christians, I guess you must vote Republican if you're a Christian, or I've seen you Christians, you don't like immigrants, and all the things that, get tossed our way, that, if you're in a certain branch of conservative Christianity right now in the United States, you dare not say certain things or you're going to get really beat up on, or maybe kicked out of your church or something like that. And to have the kind of flexibility, freedom of thought within a denomination to say, like, yeah, I might not agree with every single thing, or some things, or we need to repent of some things, like you were saying. It is a really healthy thing that a denomination wants to empower instead of disempower its members and the people participating with it.
Yeah. And I think that is pretty much foundational, I think, to our particular Reformed tradition. So I'm ordained in the church, and one of the reasons why I had grown up Presbyterian, but I'm from rural South Carolina. It might as well have been Baptist. Like it wasn't kind of holding true to many of the things. But one of the things that was very helpful was that we got seminarians, like newly out of seminary, to come to my little church, and they would throw out little nuggets of, this might be what we believe and all that. And one of the things that is foundational to the Reformed faith is we always say it's reformed and always reforming, because we kind of pride ourselves in debate and academia, which can be problematic in some ways. But I do think we don't take things at face value. And I think that now we're seeing a trajectory in the United States when it comes to Christianity, a Christianity that has a big megaphone. Like, I think there's a loudness to a certain kind of Christianity that says you can't interrogate theology. We're going to tell you this, and then you have to believe this. And it's actually great marketing, because we've simplified theology. You can't, you go to church and you're given something, you're like, this is how it is, and you take it, and you don't have to think about it. And in all honesty, if I weren't so inquisitive and a skeptic and a pessimist the way I am, I would latch on to that too, especially right now. I mean, I can see why people do it. But I think that the marketing around it has simplified faith so much so that people either don't want to interrogate it because it is a sense of comfort, and I totally get that, or they've simplified it so much so, specifically the leaders of these types of movements within Christianity, and I would say Christian nationalist movements,
right,
to where a simplified message is easy to market in order to acquire power. And so when you throw in, oh, we can ask questions about this, we can ask about scriptural context and other types of things, that breaks that kind of ability to acquire power, because you're then challenging the authority. And
Mm.
so for me, our tradition has been founded on asking a question about everything.
Mm.
And I think that for us on the podcast, we've had a lot of conversations about Christian nationalism and how that power has really kind of come forth specifically right now. I mean, it's been a long game,
Right.
but I think we are so interested in interrogating that. But on the other side, we are also interested in kind of sitting in what we believe, because I do think we tend to be like, we're not that kind of Christian, and we
Mhm.
always kind of live on that kind of moral. But I think right now, traditions and mainline denominations and what have you, that kind of encourages us to ask questions and to not take anything at face value. I think right now we need to have a louder voice, because it's
Mm.
been because Christianity has kind of been pigeonholed into what we're seeing right now as something that is not really what Jesus taught us. So
Mm.
yeah, Simon probably has more to say too. We've talked a lot about this on our
Yeah.
podcast, which has been wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been without a doubt the most common topic we've talked about since for the entire calendar year of 2025. And I think Lee summed it up really well. I think I would just add that one of the things that I learned in our conversations was that we need to also remember that sort of the rise of Christian nationalism and sort of the positions and the rise to power of more conservative Christianity, that is not just a conservative Christian problem. It has its
Mm.
roots in even the mainline Reformed tradition.
Mm.
So there's some complicity there that harkens back to how this all got started. And that means that we need to acknowledge that. That means that we still have a responsibility to confront it. It is not just those
Mm.
people there were bad and we've got it figured out over here.
Right.
If anything, that's what the current polarization is telling us we should be doing, but that's not right.
Mhm.
We need to be bridging gaps. We need to be having those difficult conversations. We need to be safe. We need to feel safe to be able to have those conversations, but this is not just a them over their problem and I'm going to
Uh-huh.
stick in my bubble over here.
Well, I love how you say that. So I want to riff off of that for a minute and ask kind of like a follow up, because you've had all these conversations about Christian nationalism, and it's easy to be like, there's a bunch of bad guys, there's a bunch of bad guys over there, but we're not like them. But that really does very little to actually solve the problem or move us in a more Christ-like direction or something. Um, what are some of the ways that you see people handling this the right way, or what sort of efforts make this even possible to push back on what is now kind of naked power grab of people claiming Christ, claiming Christianity, wrapping themselves in the American flag, and then also saying, oh, and other religions can't exist either. Like going that far is kind of like these extra steps I've never seen in my lifetime, where it used to be almost a slur to say someone was a Christian nationalist. Now people are kind of claiming it as their own.
Mm.
And yet it doesn't do us that much good to just say, oh, shame on you, that's really bad. But again, like, how do we build the bridges? What are some of your ideas about that?
Um, I think first, kind of going what Simon said, is that I do think this kind of like repenting of kind of how we have perpetuated this too. It's not just,
Mm.
again, it's all of our problems, really. The church has a steep history in some ways acquiring power, no matter how it gets to that. And I think and repentance just means turning or reorienting ourselves. It has been used in the past to kind of guilt trip you to death, to where you're scared to go to hell and you're just kind of repenting of everything. But it really is a reorientation of, what did we do wrong? How do we acknowledge that? Who did we harm? How do
Mm.
we kind of fix that and heal that process and kind of get our house in order? My grandma always said, don't tell me how to run my house until yours is in order too. So I think that we have to do that work too. And then I also think that, and I said a little bit about this before, I think we have to stand in what we believe. I think for so long, we've pointed the finger at who we are not. And I always say, you can't define yourself by who you are not. You have to define yourself as what you believe. And I went to Vanderbilt Divinity School, and one of my professors said, he was an ethics professor, and he was like, "Why are y'all scared to talk about Jesus?" And it really is kind of this, you don't want to be labeled as something, and we've been scared of that for so long that we really haven't kind of stood in our beliefs. And and I always tell people, I'm like, it's okay to say that you're a Christian. Like, it's fine to say that you're a Christian. And it's fine to say that you are a follower of Jesus and stand in that and say what that is. I think we've always just kind of run away from it. We could take a little lesson from evangelicals. They do know how to spread the word, though that word we might not agree with, but they do know how to do that, and they stand in what they believe, and they're not ashamed of it. And I think for a long time, main lines and maybe more left-leaning ways of doing church have been kind of scared to kind of claim that. And I always say, like, that's fine. Like, you can claim that, and we can claim it and also, work with other peoples of different faiths. I just think that there's this weirdness of standing in who you are that I think really has held us back in a way. And so I always say, if we want to do something different, we have to figure out who we are as followers of Jesus and really stand in that and not be afraid of it, and get out there and say it. And that's not saying demonize other faiths, which Christian nationalists do in some way. It's not saying, like, you have to give into those tropes, but it's simply saying, like, this is what I identify as, and I'm going to stand in it, and this is what this means. And so I think that that's a start, is kind of that interior work and that repentance work, and then, see what's next. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite quotes from the last year from one of our podcast guests is that conservative Christianity and those that perpetuate Christian nationalism, they have good spirituality and bad theology, whereas more progressive denominations, we have good theology and bad spirituality. And I think that sort of sums up what Lee was describing, where conservative Christianity is very much focused on the relationship between the individual and God. And that's why it's very easy to say, oh, well, I'm a follower of Jesus, right? But they can boldly say that. But a lot of the values they have are rooted in problematic theology. Whereas in the Reformed traditions, we might say we have good theology because we say, oh, of course, we can ordain, we can love, and queer people can be married in our congregations and in our churches, and we accept you. But we are not good at talking about the individual relationship between ourselves and God. And that's because we don't want to sound like those conservative Christians. So we are afraid to be bold in saying that we are Christians. So then we just cede that entire conversation to a group that is perpetuating values and policies that we don't agree with. And so I think within sort of the more progressive faith tradition, something we have to do, as Lee said, is to not be afraid to be bold. But we also need to say, within, even for lack of a better word, if we said our own camps, we need to also recognize that this is not a game of being better than someone else. It's just about being faithful.
Yeah.
And I think that this is why we also see, for example, in politics, it's the same reason. I'll just go ahead and say it. I think the Democrats don't win a whole lot because they're constantly trying to one up each other, with the result that no one is ever good enough.
Yeah.
Contrast that with a more conservative stance, which is that, hey, life, values, the country, and the Bible are very simple. It is these 3 or 4 points. It's a lot easier to rally someone around 3 or 4 points than, well, what does it mean to be faithful if we have to, there's so much more to go through and to think about, even if that's actually what we're called to do as Christians.
Yeah. With the the left in political terms seems to be driven on, or kind of gathers around, identity politics, which is in a way great. It's like, we have room for you. It doesn't matter. The other side might be like, here's what we're against, that we're going to circle the wagons and we're going to, take care of our own. And yet, in a way, everybody misses out on all these common ground ideas that are not polarizing, that people can kind of agree on. I was just watching a guy, and he was talking about, here's 15 things we already know the left and the right agree on, that we could do something, but no one wants to do the hard work of putting down. Everybody's happy to be entrenched and be like, we're not you and we're not you,
Yeah.
But actually getting the hard work done is a whole different matter, and you wind up having just people taking revenge on their political enemies, instead of representing the people that have elected them. And speaking to a little bit of what you said about what the church has not done in terms of some of these mainline progressive or liberal churches in their denominations, is that this idea of holding back, and then the other louder evangelicals, maybe with the megaphone, are like the only voice anybody hears, right? And as I've been thinking about that too, we were talking a little bit, I think just very briefly, but we were talking about Mr. Rogers. And I'm from Pittsburgh. I love Mr. Rogers, big time fan, and how he was an ordained Presbyterian minister. And it wasn't, you didn't necessarily know what he believed in terms of theological bullet points, but how he lived and his way of being. His way of being was like the way of Jesus, and he was living out love. He was loving on other people. He was sometimes the only friendly, kind, or loving face a child might have in their day, and he was being Jesus to people. And there's something very beautiful about just that life well lived, that is grounded completely theologically in the ministry and the ways of Christ. It says, of course, his lifetime of work says so much. Nothing can be taken from it, really. And yet, sometimes we wind up seeding these sort of cultural, it could be like these tit for tat kind of cultural I don't know, inflection points or something, to sort of get points and get more people on our side. But when I think about what makes the deepest impact for people who are maybe adjacent to the church, maybe feel hurt by the church or something, or maybe the church isn't for them, because maybe they feel that they're on the outside, because the loudest Christians might be saying, we don't like you, we don't love you. I think about what I was going to be speaking about with you guys a little bit, about the Sermon on the Mount, and this kind of these chapters in Matthew that really ground our faith. And we know what Jesus thought because of the Sermon on the Mount. We know the way of Jesus and the kingdom of God because of the Sermon on the Mount. And then, is that what we're living out? Is that what we're espousing and kind of drawing on? And so if you don't have a good answer for this or anything like that, but I would love to, that's fine too. This could be on the edit floor, but I would love to hear a little bit about what you think in terms of this sort of grounding teaching of Jesus, and how it either relates to your life or what we can do as we try to draw people to the light of Christ.
I think that something that I've been observing in our conversations around the rise of Christian nationalism is that it is easier to be loud when you have a message that is built on fear and is built on, I will say it, hate. It is much harder to be loud with a message of love. And that might sound like kind of cheesy, but I do think it's true. It is much harder to stand in solidarity and in love than to just say, I don't like you. Or for example, you have someone who you disagree with. It's much easier to tell them why they're wrong than to sit there and lovingly have a conversation that asks, why do you believe what you believe? How did you arrive to this conclusion? What experiences informed your perspective on this? Because that's actually a really good way to get to understand someone. The other thing is that if you do that, they will be more open to having a conversation with you. Again, we need to feel safe in these conversations.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that that is actually what Jesus calls us to do in the Sermon on the Mount.
Mm.
It is to do that hard work of loving and to listen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if we start there,
That's
we probably
hard.
have a better chance at bridging a lot of gaps, but that's really hard, especially it's really hard. And I mean, I'll just use an example. I was in a church and I heard someone say they have like a neighbor whose child is transgender. And they said, I feel sorry for them. And I said, why? Why do you feel sorry or sad for them? And they said, well, I mean, I love them, but their life is going to be hard. And I said, so are you sorry for them being who they are, or are you sorry that the world will not accept them? And I saw this like sort of the gears turning. They said, oh, the second one. The second one. That's what I meant. And I said, okay, because the way that you said that, I couldn't tell exactly what you meant. And they said, yeah, no, it's that they're in a world that doesn't accept them, not that they are who they are. And so I think, I was polite. I wasn't rude. I'm not trying to toot my own horn either, but it's like just that the sitting there and wondering, what did you mean? Where is your perspective coming from? What is it rooted in? I think that gives us a chance to live into who we are as followers of Jesus. And, you know, when we just take a look at the Sermon on the Mount, when we think about, you know, we say the meek will inherit the earth and the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. How are we supposed to understand that if we're not willing to sit down and actually have conversations with people? Because sometimes I'm sure that we've all had this, where we sit down and we think that we have the answer, and then we actually find out that we're the one poor in spirit because we learned from the conversation with someone else.
Yeah. And the conversations that we've had, I've learned that, and we've talked to people who have done this work for years and years and years, and it is, Jesus didn't say that this was going to happen in a snap. And I think that is one of the things that we have seen is the kind of the expediting of faith. Is it's very simple. You ask and you shall receive. You know, that's kind of what I heard growing up, like, and you receive it immediately. You go to the altar, you get saved, and you're good. You're good to go until the next time you need to go down to the altar. You feel shame. I've been saved like 25 times. Like, that's just kind of how it is. But I do think that for me, it's such a long game that I think we don't actually know what we're signing up for when we say we're a Christian. It is something that takes time. It takes intentionality. It takes relationship. And we've had this conversation too about our own tradition, but it's not just ours. Is that we've kind of centered our faith around academia and then sometimes elitism to the point to where we think we can think ourselves out of situations, and that's just not how this works. It is such a long game that we have to, for one, we have to be like spiritually nurtured and to take that time and do that interior work for ourselves. But it takes such a long time. You know, I supplied pastor in rural churches in Tennessee, and I went to Vanderbilt Divinity School, and sometimes they'd be like, "Oh, send Lee out there because he sounds like they do." And I am a queer person, and so some of these places, and I'm from rural South Carolina, some of these places may or may not have been safe for me to go to.
Mm-hmm.
But in my naive mind, I did. And I supplied pastored at 2 churches that were together. They were yoked together,
Okay.
45 minutes apart, and very different congregations. So you had to preach at one and then haul your butt to get to the next one right afterwards to make it to the service, to the other one. But and I was very intentional about not sharing a lot about things just for my own safety, but throwing out little nuggets here and there. And this went on for like a year or so. I go out there, preach, do that, and come back. And then literally about 2 years ago, they hired a full-time minister, and he sent me a message and he said, I don't think you realize that you being there, how you transformed these churches, because they're actually asking about, can you be queer and be a minister? Like, let's talk about how we can be more inclusive. And one of them was at one of the first prides in their county, and it was one of the few churches that were there. And so honestly, you just never know how the Spirit's going to work, but it is honestly a long game. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we are seeing such a megaphone of a very simplistic faith that doesn't take a lot of work. All you got to do is believe in it. But the Sermon on the Mount and the teachings of Jesus did this for years and years, and he was surrounded by people and was in relationship, and he didn't throw an academic theological jargon out. And that to me is also like the interpretation piece of it and the accessibility of theology. I think it has become such a, just so academic, and we can get so intertwined in it, and we're not able to interpret or to make that accessible. And the same with politics. I'm from rural South Carolina. That is why Democrats are not doing well. It's like you can't make what your policies are accessible to the people who want, and not saying dumb it down. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it. How does it impact their lives? How does it change their lives? And that to me is one of the gaps in the church is we believe in so many great things, and yet it's hard for us to translate that out to how it impacts a certain community or a context. But it is also just not going to happen overnight. And that's a part of our culture, is that we're very capitalistic, instantaneous, like dopamine hit. That's not how this works. And I think that's the story that we have to tell over and over again, is that transformation does not happen overnight. And nor should we expect someone to change overnight. And I think that too is a part of how we approach something, is that we have to give a lot of grace, and some people are equipped for that and some people aren't. And I think that we have to know where we are at in our certain bodies and how we approach people. But for me, the Sermon on the Mount, to talk about who will inherit the kingdom of God, such a vast kind of concept, that kind of stuff doesn't happen overnight. That's just not possible. And one of the things that I appreciate about the Gospels, I love the Gospel of Mark, simply because there is no resurrected body. There is, but it's tacked on and it wasn't original. But at the end it said, you will find him back in Galilee, back where he started. And so it is a cyclical thing when we're talking about discipleship with Jesus. This is not a linear process, a goal of heaven on earth, like heaven or a mansion or jewels in your crown. To be honest, that was all in hymns. Some of that is not even biblical. But I think the cyclical aspect of our faith and how we have to constantly kind of go around and kind of maybe revisit things and re-engage in some communities. It's a long term. It's not something that we might not see the benefit after we're gone, but it's all about planting seeds, and I don't know how marketable that is these days. So that's my biggest
Right.
challenge is how do we make that something that people have the ability to get on board with that, and how do we kind of say that faith is not like an ATM machine, really?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. To your point, um, I've heard this said too among people who are in peace and justice spheres or have done peace negotiations, is that the work of peace, the work of justice, the work of racial healing isn't years or months or years or decades. It's actually generational. It's multi-generational, where you're raising up new leaders and training them and seeing past your own lifetime too, which is just so countercultural. I don't think in politics certainly isn't thought of beyond the election cycle, like, oh, maybe someone is going to get in that I don't like, who will use all these, loopholes I've created to do what they want. Nobody can even see like past 4 years sometimes. And yet we really are part of the church, past, present, and future. What God is up to and what God will be up to as it carries on. I think that's just such an excellent point of shifting our perspective and not getting so upset when it's not working out as we think it should right now, because it's never going to be doing that. It's never going to be. And I think that instantaneous stuff and that simple stuff that people are latching onto, as you were speaking about, it will collapse on itself. It just is not sustainable. And there'll be different iterations that pop up, I think, again and again with these sort of easy answers. But you're right, it is a long view that is so important.
Yeah. And Mr. Rogers knew that too. How long was he on TV? Like,
I don't even know.
he
40
was, it was
years?
it was a long time. And just to go to Mr. Rogers, I think it was one of the smartest things that anybody could have ever done was to start a TV show about values instead of maybe about faith, but a show about morality and how creativity also enters this, is that, simple faith and kind of this ability to simplify in a very transactional faith also dampens creativity, because power and empire and all those kind of systems of oppression find that to be a threat,
Right.
because it is a part of God, really. Like, we are gifted the ability of imagination and creativity from the creator who created all of this. And so I think for just Mr. Rogers and other people who do media and who are out there writing like creative fiction and creating like fictional like realities that have all these wonderful morals. I always tell people, if y'all want to start like learning about folk and getting to know different people, read like fiction from people of color and like fantasy from queer people and all these things, because that is where worlds are created and creativity is out there. And Mr. Rogers was great at doing that. And yeah, he was an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, but he was also someone that could translate faith to a broader audience. And I think that is such a powerful thing, is the translation bit and the accessibility bit, to just say, this is how you do this in everyday life. Like, it's not rocket science. And that's another thing. We overcomplicate stuff. But I do think that we have the ability to be that creative too. And I hope that, doing stuff like this is one of the reasons why we started the podcast, is that we have to have more conversations out there, and for people to understand that there are different ways of doing this and more sustainable ways, as you were saying, Lisa. Like, the simple faith, I've had it, and if you crack it once, your whole world falls apart. And so it's so traumatic. And so what does it look like for us to have sustainable faith and not a faith that is just hinging on one little pivot or one little piece that can just tear it all apart. And that to me is where the loudness comes in, is because it's so fragile, you have to be loud to defend it. So, yeah.
You want to riff on that, Simon? Or anything that's come to mind as we've been chatting?
I think that Lee said it pretty well, honestly. I think that when we talk about making faith or scripture too simple, we really run the risk of not being open to possibility. And we've seen that in Christian nationalism. We see that in certain elements of conservative Christianity. And that's why I go back to asking someone why they believe what they believe. And I think that actually is a better bridging question than saying what you believe is wrong and here's why.
Yeah.
Because sometimes people may say, well, I had an experience. I'll just use an example. When I was doing a webinar series on gun violence, one of the best things that I thought I learned from doing that series on gun violence prevention was instead of just having people say like what their position is on guns, if you give them a spectrum of what they think is reasonable gun ownership and what their experience is with guns, everyone is going to be somewhere in this spectrum, right? And they're going to be at different points. Let's say 0 is no guns for anyone, all the way to all the guns for everyone.
Right.
People are going to be somewhere in that spectrum. And then you ask why, and you ask them to share how they arrived at, what experiences informed that perspective.
Right.
Even if you never change their mind, you understand better why they believe what they believe. Your chances of having more interaction and more conversation with them go up because you have started from a place of empathy and understanding, not a place of superiority or belittling, which and especially in heated conversations around faith and justice is so easy to, we can get emotional very quick. And so I think that, again, going back to why do you believe what you believe, what experiences informed that? And sometimes people may not know that answer right away. And sometimes the answer may be because my pastor said so, or because my parents said so. And I'm not saying that's like not a real thing. But then because that gives you the opportunity to then say, okay, so I understand that's what your parents said. I understand that's what your pastor said. But how have you seen that in your own life? What has been your experience? You give them the opportunity to interrogate a bit more. And if that leads them to, they may just double down, in which case it is what it is. But I do think that when we think about the Sermon on the Mount, once again, we have to be thinking about what it means when we think about who's going to inherit the earth. I think we also need to be asking ourselves and each other, what earth? Why do you believe what you believe? Who do you think that you're one of the ones inheriting the kingdom? Why? What has led you to that perspective? And I think that allows us to reach a more common humanity, hopefully.
Yeah, one of the things we've been saying, I think we've been saying simple faith, meaning that there's these easy answers we can latch on to, and then our mind's made up. Nothing can assail. There's a lot of fear behind, if you pull one of those legs out from this, maybe not simple faith, but maybe like small enclosed and inflexibleness and we can all become inflexible too, not just like conservatives or something like that. We can all become inflexible, but there's a lot of fear behind somebody, sort of falling out of faith or falling away or all the things without any of the curiosity that, of course, your faith can stand up to questions. And even if you have to deconstruct or you have to rethink things, or you have to realize that the Christian tradition involves a lot of things you might not even be aware of in the 2000 years, that it is deeply rooted and strong enough to handle your doubts and your mistakes or your misunderstandings. And but they're, like you're saying, Simon, about asking people questions. I was in a Sunday school class where there was a person who was, the subject came up about not so much pro-life, but capital punishment, and how it's fine. People deserve what they get when they get capital punishment. And I'm of a pro-life mindset that you don't take people's lives, and that actually lets them off easy, that their life should be, they should have a chance to repair or some kind of reparations towards the family that they've harmed. And if you kill them off, you're playing God with the whole murdering thing, but you're also depriving the family who's been harmed of any chance of any kind of restoration, or it doesn't make them feel any better when that person's dead. They're just still at a loss of whatever happened. And it was interesting because for the person who was speaking, we were going back and forth a little bit, but there was so much emotion and there was so much riding for this guy on this, like, don't take this away from me. Don't take this away from me. And I thought, I'm thinking you might be wrong. Like, I could be wrong too, but I know that God doesn't want us killing each other. I wasn't saying this, but I was thinking, it was just a teachable moment for me to witness the kind of emotion and the kind of fear surrounding this idea of what's just and what's fair and what God wants. And it just kind of, I guess, reinforced to me that if our faith is fearful and we're not willing to be curious and ask questions and be stable in our way of Jesus, if we're not, we can handle people who disagree with us. It will not get us personally all, flustered and upset. That sometimes what that will happen, we'll get into these silos of that's them and they believe this and they're the bad guys and that's them. So it is really important to be continually curious and continually asking those questions and not even expecting that anybody's going to see it our way, I suppose.
Yeah, you won't. That's the thing. I think that for me, and where I've seen this, the examples of it the most is in communities that are on the margins. I think people like liberation theologies and queer theologies, and because we've literally just had to do that all of our lives. And I think that there is in some senses, when we're talking about maybe this small faith or this insular faith that is not nimble, is because for many who hold it, they might not have ever had to be nimble in their lives, or they've it's a very privileged stance, in my opinion, to just be able to believe it and not like move away from it. And not saying that our faith can't bring us comfort, or our faith can't, be around in times of need. Like, I think that's great. But I do think that the way in which we hold on to faith with like a death grip, it's, if you do that, you're going to suffocate something. And I think it's just like a puppy, like what was that Looney Tunes character who loved her dogs or her pets so much she just squeezed them and squeezed them and squeezed them, and their eyes were bugging out, and you suffocate it, and you literally cannot breathe, it cannot relax. Like, faith in of itself can't take a breath and say, actually, we need room. And the thing is, when you constrict something, I have a science background. When you constrict something so much, it builds up pressure. And when that pressure explodes, to me, that is what we see when people are reactive. We're seeing that right now in the administration. When pressure and pressure and pressure just explodes, humanity will do the most illogical things that you can imagine. Like, you can sit here and we can say, that's not logical, that's not right. But it's out of something that's so reactive and so emotional that they don't even know they're doing it probably half the time. So I think that one of the things that it does to us, it just constricts us so much so that at some point it will explode. And I've seen it happen in my own life where you just have a faith crisis to where your faith was so constricted and it explodes and it shatters and it tears your life apart. It really does. And it sends you into places that you never thought you would be. It's amazing I found myself back here, and to be honest. But I think that what that does to folk and what we've seen over and over again is, I mean, this is why empires fall, is because of that pressure buildup and things just explode because you constrict and constrict and constrict, and physics will tell you it'll blow up. And I think that that is something that we have to remind ourselves too, is to give ourselves breathing room to kind of begin to do the process of saying, well, if I do question this, what do I think is going to happen? For me, it was eternal damnation, which is a great thing to tell somebody if you want them to believe something. It's like, if you don't believe this, you're going to go here. And it's happened over and over and over again. And I think I always say this about faith, is that faith in and of itself is so easy to manipulate because we are actually taking it upon ourselves to believe something that we may or may not see. And people know how easy that is to manipulate, which is infuriating because it's throughout time, it has brought comfort and peace and love. And yet there is a group of people that can come in and say, oh, there's something we can tap into because of so much vulnerability that people have in their lives, that people are looking for something. People are looking for comfort. People are looking for something to hold on to in their lives, probably more now than ever. And it's sad when you see something be so manipulated to where, like, the goodness of a person, they want something to bring them comfort. Like, everybody wants that. But it's these power dynamics and these power systems that take it and manipulate it and tap into that vulnerability or that fear. And I'm not saying I have fear. Like, we all have something that we're fearful of. But it takes intentionality to do that. And I think that that is something that we also have to continue to talk about too, is faith is a dangerous thing. It can be, but it can also be the most life-saving thing. And it's a fine line. And we have to be honest about that. And we have to continue to have the conversations and do the work to say, we have to be honest about religious trauma. We do. And I don't think we are enough honest about that. But I think we can be. And I think that there is hope. And I see hope in all the people who are out here living out their faith. They might not be throwing it in people's faces, but they're out here on the streets saving lives. And I think that that is something, if anybody should know something, is that that's what we're here to do. We want people to live and be who they are and do what they feel like they need to do with their own bodies and things like that. And this is life and death work. And it's hard, but it's worth it. If one person is saved, I say my day is my job is good. Like, I've done what I needed to do for that day. Because every life, should have a chance to live into its fullness. But I do think that pressurization is what we're seeing. And if we don't kind of let out some of the pressure, it's like a pressure cooker. I made a roast the other day. If you don't let it out, you can't reap the benefit of what you made, or it's going to blow up. So I think we're in that moment right now. And I do hope that churches speak up more and not live out of that fear to kind of relieve some of that pressure. Really. Yeah.
Simon, I'll give you the last word, and then it's a great place to wrap it up.
Lee, as I've been contemplating getting a dog sometime in the next year, you're reminding me not to squeeze it too hard, because I will be so excited to have this
Let it
puppy
breathe.
and to be gentle with it. Yeah.
Oh.
I think just on this topic of questioning,
Mhm.
just to remind folks that if we're not open to questions, what does that say about our own belief about who God is?
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is, if we keep putting human judgments, human expectations, human parameters, human limitations on God, we inevitably are going to put those limitations on ourselves. And I'll just use an example. I'm multiracial. I am Chinese American and I am white. And for a while, I kind of like struggled with that because, you know, there's how you look, there's how you present, there's what languages do you speak or not speak, how do you pronounce your last name, what do you know about culture? There are all these things that people like to ask. And I'm not saying it's wrong to ask those questions. I think sometimes they come from a perspective of wanting to understand, but sometimes they come from a perspective of wanting to put you in a box.
Mm-hmm.
As I've gotten older, when I think about God and when I think about Jesus, I remember being like, man, which box am I supposed to check? Do I check Asian? Do I check white? Do I check other? Do I check all three?
Right.
And after a while, I started thinking about Jesus, and I was like, man, Jesus had a lot of identities and he wore all of them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He could check all the boxes. He might not check any of them. I was like, why am I concerning myself about what boxes to check? I would not want to put limits on God. And I'm not putting myself on that level by any means. But if I believe that I'm made in the image of God, that means that also I can carry multiple identities. I can carry multiple experiences in the way and determine for myself what that means for me.
Right.
And it took me 20 some years to get there on something that is ultimately not controversial and only matters to me.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if it only matters to you, but yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, like, oh, yeah. Well, it's the conversation going on within your own head at the very least.
Yeah.
And so I think about if people might be sitting there being like, well, I believe God, I believe this about myself, or I believe this about God, so therefore I have to be this way, or you have to be this way. We have to be this way.
Right.
Let's just take a step back again and ask the questions about why we believe what we believe, but also how does what I believe reflect what I believe about God? What am I saying about God? And I think that may lead us back to some really interesting introspective questions as a society, as faith communities, and also for ourselves as we're trying to just navigate life.
Yeah. You know, being half Puerto Rican, I get it. I'm white presenting, but I never know what box to check because I'm all of the boxes. I have African ancestors as well. And, but the imposition, the outside imposition of you better tell us who you are. And now they want Puerto Rican people to not just pick that ethnicity, but they want, no, say white or black. What are you? Well, it doesn't work like that in Latino culture. And it's like, I push back. I put other, Simon. I'm always putting other. I like, or nothing at all, because, you know, that's the imposition that isn't of God. You know, it's so that people can divide and say, well, you're this, or there's too many of these types, or whatever. And I think that that's the beautiful freedom that we have in Christ, is that we all are exactly loved the same way, and we don't have to, you know, we don't have to check off any box with God. And I love those. I love this conversation with you guys. You've given me a lot to think about, and the perspectives, and asking good questions. It makes me kind of inspired for the people that I wind up rubbing up against. Instead of bristling, or instead of, you know, inwardly rolling my eyes, I can just ask more questions like, why is that so for you? And so I really appreciate being able to speak with both of you today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, Thanks so much for having us, Lisa, and really appreciate your audience.